Breaking news, and this one feels like the spark that set the entire Hollywood battlefield ablaze. Because late last night, the courts unsealed a stack of documents that many thought would never see the light of day. And inside those pages is a story that is far bigger and far darker than the glossy press releases and carefully staged interviews that have been fed to the public for months. And if you thought this saga was about a movie, then think again. Because what these files reveal is a blueprint for how power really works in Hollywood, and how far some of the industry's biggest names are willing to go when control, money, and reputation are on the line. And at the center of it all stands Blake Lively, the star who was packaged to the public as a victim, as a misunderstood actress trying to hold her ground against a co-star and director, Justin Baldoni. But when you peel back the curtain, you see something else entirely. You see manipulation, backroom plotting, and a ruthless chess game where every piece was carefully moved, not to protect anyone, but to crush anyone who stood in the way. And standing right beside her in the shadows was Ryan Reynolds, her husband, the actor. Everyone knows for charm and sarcasm, but inside these documents, he is painted not just as the supportive partner, but as the alleged mastermind, the strategist who turned a marital alliance into a Hollywood power machine. Because according to the filings, this was not about justice or even about fixing a troubled set. This was about power, plain and simple, and the way it started is almost too subtle to notice unless you know what to look for. Because back in late 2023, when tensions on set were rising, Blake Lively forced Justin to sign what has now been dubbed the safety letter. And on the surface, this letter was framed as a simple protective measure, a document to ensure her comfort and security. But in reality, and according to multiple testimonies, it was far more than that. It was the key that unlocked the control room it gave her. Not just protections, but the leverage to dictate edits, rewrites, even marketing decisions. And suddenly the balance of the entire production shifted overnight. Justin, the man who had shepherded the project from its earliest stages, confided to friends that he felt like the captain of a ship held hostage. Every move, every word, every choice monitored and ready to be twisted against him. And from that moment on, the battlefield was drawn. The director who had believed he was steering the project now realized he was little more than a figurehead, while the true control rested with Blake, and by extension with Ryan, and the tension did not stay hidden behind studio doors. It exploded in moments that insiders will never forget. One meeting in particular stands out where Ryan himself allegedly stormed into the room, red-faced and furious, screaming at Justin, and making it clear that this was no longer just about a creative disagreement. This was about domination, but the war didn't stop on set. No. The documents make it clear the real conflict was waged in the press and in the shadows of public perception, because once Blake secured her grip on production, the strategy shifted to phase 2, controlling the story. Controlling the audience, and the documents outline in chilling detail how that strategy was rolled out, piece by piece. First came the leaks, and the timing was surgical according to the unsealed pages in August 2024. Just days after Justin's team refused to release a statement that would have effectively taken the blame for production
yeah,
rumors.
we're all so proud of it. They're with me every step of the way.
Well, I loved you with the red hair. It was
Thank
really
you.
neat.
Thank you. Thank
Brandon,
you so much.
the chemistry between Lily and Atlas, it's fireworks. It's undeniable. What made it so easy to fall in love on screen?
I couldn't tell you. I mean, we didn't really talk about it.
You could tell her.
I mean, I could tell you it's...
You could say like really nice things.
I'm just
about
a
me.
really good actor, you know? I'm a really good actor. Everything was really challenging with Blake.
He had a mirror. It was
Yeah.
weird. It was the
Yeah.
off camera was instead of
I find
mirror.
it...
Ryan's hand becomes clear. The documents show that he personally pitched stories to outlets like the Daily Mail, presenting himself as the savior swooping in to fix a broken script. A script, by the way, written by a woman based on a book, by a woman, and already approved by the studio before the strikes. The arrogance dripped from every word of those planted stories, framing Ryan as the hero and Justin as the incompetent villain, and legal experts noted in the documents that such interference could even border on violations of Writers Guild strike rules. If true, Ryan's so-called heroics weren't just arrogant, they were potentially unlawful. And while this played out in the headlines behind the scenes, Justin's team recognized the pattern. One PR strategist wrote in an email, "Ryan looks the worst. This plays good for us, bad for them," meaning even insiders could see that arrogance was creating cracks in their polished narrative. But by then, the smear campaign was in full force, and Justin was already bleeding money fighting back because defending his name wasn't cheap. Not when every day brought a new leak, a new headline, a new exclusive that cast him in the worst possible light by mid-2024, the filings confirm. Justin's team had spent close to $9 million on crisis management hiring experts like Melissa Nathan to counter every single attack, every whisper campaign, every manipulated headline. And this wasn't a marketing budget to promote a film. This was a war chest to keep a career from collapsing under the weight of carefully coordinated smears. And the irony is cruel, because even as Justin's team privately opposed the direction of the film's marketing, they were contractually obligated to promote it, meaning he was attacked for strategies he didn't control but was forced to support. And through it all, Blake and Ryan continued to frame themselves as the heroes, the guardians of a film in chaos, when in reality the documents suggest they were the ones creating the chaos to begin with, chaos by design. One insider called it because the more unstable the set looked, the weaker Justin appeared, and the easier it became to justify Blake's sudden rise to producer status, because here's the shocking twist hidden in those filings after securing her safety letter. Blake leveraged it into a PGA-recognized producer credit, something that allowed her to override creative decisions, force script changes, and even dictate final edits. And that kind of power doesn't come easy in Hollywood, especially not for a project already greenlit by a studio. Yet Blake found a way, and Ryan capitalized on it, positioning himself as the script doctor, the fixer, the one man who could salvage what the studio had already approved. And in doing so, he inserted himself not just into the production, but into the story of the film itself, shifting the narrative from Justin's vision to Blake and Ryan's shared empire. And while the public saw a love story playing out on screen, the documents show a very different love story unfolding off screen. A partnership built not just on romance, but on strategy, on power, and on the willingness to dismantle anyone who stood in the way. Because for Blake and Ryan, this was never about one film. This was about legacy. Producer credits mean profits, marketing control means image, and image in Hollywood means everything. So while Justin fought to keep his career intact, Blake and Ryan fought for ownership of the project's success. Every dollar, every headline, every award season. Whisper rewritten to trace back to them. And the chilling part is how well it worked, at least for a while. The public bought it. The press repeated it. The narrative stuck Blake the victim, Ryan the rescuer, Justin the problem. But as these documents reveal, that story was never the truth. It was a carefully constructed fiction, and if this was only part one of the battle, the war that followed would make even Hollywood's most ruthless players stop and take notes, because this wasn't just scandal, it was strategy, and it was only the beginning of a takedown that cost one man nearly everything. By the time the smear campaign reached full speed, Hollywood insiders were no longer whispering, they were watching in real time, a takedown that felt less like a feud between collaborators and more like a military-style operation carried out with precision and patience, and the newly unsealed documents make clear. This was not accidental chaos, but a playbook that had been drafted long before the first headline hit the web. And at the heart of this playbook sat one goal: control the story. Because in Hollywood, perception is everything, and whoever controls the perception controls the power. So while Justin Baldoni scrambled to protect his reputation, Blake Lively and Ryan Reynolds were executing a coordinated strategy that turned gossip columns and entertainment outlets into weapons, and the way they did it is a masterclass in how narrative warfare works. First, the HR complaints, weak though they were, became the cornerstone of a public image campaign. And when TMZ ran with them, the timing was not coincidence. It was choreography. Insiders confirmed through the court filings that the leaks came directly from Blake's camp, and Ryan was fully aware of how it would land, because the goal was not to prove misconduct, the goal was to plant doubt. And once doubt is planted, it spreads like wildfire. People stop asking whether the complaints are true and start asking what else could be true. What else might he have done? And while Justin faced those suspicions, Ryan was working the press in another way, crafting a parallel story that positioned him as the savior, swooping in to rescue a film that was allegedly drowning under bad leadership and a broken script. The irony, of course, is that the script had already been greenlit and approved before the writer's strike, meaning Ryan's interference wasn't just unnecessary. It may have crossed into dangerous territory of scabbing during an active labor stoppage, something the documents point out with chilling clarity, and yet the headlines painted Ryan as the hero and Justin as the incompetent. The narrative was working, but inside Justin's team saw exactly what was happening, and the price tag to fight back was staggering $9 million spent. On crisis PR teams, monitoring every leak, countering every false story, issuing statements that barely made a dent in the tidal wave of negative press. This wasn't just expensive, it was exhausting. One advisor wrote in an email unearthed in the filings, every day is a battle. We wake up to another headline, another leak, another whisper. We put out one fire only to find 3 more lit overnight. And the worst part, Justin could not go on the offensive because the contracts tied him to the very marketing campaign he hated while his own name was being dragged through the mud. The official accounts of the movie continued posting the flowery pastel tone promo content designed by Blake and Ryan, a campaign that critics blasted as tone deaf for a story about domestic violence, but Justin had no choice contractually. He had to stand behind it even while it damaged him further. This paradox is one of the most revealing details in the filings because it shows how completely he had been boxed in, unable to speak freely, unable to control the marketing, forced to carry water for a campaign that undermined his credibility, and every time he tried to defend himself, another leak would drop, carefully timed to redirect the narrative. Back to Blake and Ryan's script, and the sheer relentlessness of it is what stands out. Not 1 or 2 accusations, not 1 or 2 articles, but a sustained stream of stories strategically placed in TMZ, the Daily Mail, Variety, and a slew of entertainment. Blogs and influencers, one leak would accuse Justin of bullying Blake on set. The next would claim he was dismissive of female writers. The next would suggest the film was spiraling out of control under his leadership, and each time Ryan and Blake appeared as the solution. The heroes saving a doomed project, and audiences lapped it up because the story was clean, simple, easy to digest, and above all, familiar. Hollywood loves the narrative of the troubled man, corrected by the strong woman, and the witty, charming husband swooping in as backup. But what the filings show is that this narrative wasn't organic. It was engineered line by line, leak by leak, headline by headline. And if that was all the story, would already be scandalous enough. But the deeper you dig, the more dangerous it looks, because the documents also reveal that Ryan and Blake were not just fighting to protect Blake's comfort on set. They were maneuvering for producer power, a title that comes with creative control, back-end profits, and industry clout. The safety letter Blake had forced Justin to sign late in 2023 became the golden ticket that elevated her from star to producer. And once she had that title, every creative decision became her battlefield. She demanded script rewrites. She insisted on controlling edits. She approved or rejected marketing materials. And when people inside the studio asked how she suddenly had this power, the leaks about HR complaints served as the perfect cover. See, we had to take control. Justin was the problem. It wasn't about ego, it was about safety. At least that was the story being sold to the outside world, but inside Wayfarer Studios, one insider put it bluntly in an email described in the filings chaos by design. Blake and Ryan created the instability, then used it as justification to seize control. It is a strategy so audacious it almost defies belief, and yet line after line of testimony points to it happening in plain sight. And while Justin was burning through millions of dollars to defend himself, Blake and Ryan were turning every attack into a stepping stone for their own image. Ryan planting hero stories, Blake positioning herself as the indispensable producer, and together framing Justin as the villain. And the most bitter twist of all is that Justin still had to work alongside them, smiling in photos, attending press events, even while knowing that behind the scenes the knives were out and being used against him every day. And this tension was not confined to the set. The documents describe how it spilled into personal interactions, with one particularly explosive moment when Ryan stormed into a meeting and unloaded on Justin in front of others, a power play meant to humiliate him and establish dominance. And this wasn't the only instance. Multiple notes show a pattern of hostility, intimidation, and manipulation that stretched far beyond ordinary creative disagreements. But here's where the story begins to turn, because as aggressive as Blake and Ryan's strategy was, there were cracks beginning to show. Even at this stage, their carefully crafted narrative was beginning to wobble, because the same arrogance that fueled their takeover also blinded them to how it might be received. And while they believed the leaks and planted stories would go unanswered, the truth has a way of seeping out, especially when it comes to public reaction. And the filings note emails where Justin's team quietly celebrated moments when Ryan's arrogance backfired, such as his claim of saving a female-written script during a strike. One PR consultant wrote, "This plays good for us, bad for them." And it turned out to be prophetic, because soon the smear machine they had built would collide with something they could not control, the audience itself. And the backlash that was about to erupt would expose just how fragile their empire of spin really was. And this is where the story begins to twist in a way that Blake Lively and Ryan Reynolds never anticipated. Because while they had spent months carefully orchestrating leaks, planting stories, and painting themselves as the heroes of a film supposedly spiraling out of control, the one thing they couldn't buy, manipulate, or script was the audience itself. And by the summer of 2024, the very public they thought they controlled started pushing back in ways that made their entire narrative crumble. From the inside out, at first, the backlash was small, quiet, almost unnoticeable. TikTok users mocking the pastel flower-filled marketing campaign for a film that was supposed to center on domestic violence, survivors of abuse pointing out how tone-deaf and offensive the promos felt, critics hinting that the story was being packaged as a summer romance instead of the sobering tale it was meant to be. And at first, Blake's team dismissed it as noise, online chatter that would fade once the big outlets pushed their own glossy features, but it didn't fade. It grew, and it grew fast, because what started as a handful of videos became a wave. Algorithms picked up the anger, survivors began speaking louder, and soon hashtags were trending. Not praising the film, but questioning how an actress who claimed to care about women's voices could approve such shallow, harmful marketing. And the filings show in internal notes how terrified Blake's camp became in those weeks, because this wasn't Justin's PR team manufacturing criticism. This was organic, raw, and untouchable. The backlash belonged to the public, and because of that, it couldn't be controlled. And worse for Blake, the more she spoke, the deeper she dug herself into. The whole one resurfaced interview clip shows her brushing off a question about domestic violence with a flippant remark, something that might have slid under the radar before. But in the context of this growing backlash, it looked dismissive, cold. Even manipulative, and social media did the rest, dissecting her tone, replaying her words, compiling montages of moments where she seemed to sidestep or belittle serious questions. And soon the conversation shifted from whether Justin Baldoni was difficult to whether Blake herself was the problem, whether her victim narrative was manufactured, whether she was hiding behind Ryan's shadow while pulling strings to seize control. And when that shift happened, the walls they had built around their story began to crack, because the very strategy that once made them untouchable, the leaks, the planted headlines, the spin, suddenly looked less like protection and more like manipulation. Journalists who had repeated Blake and Ryan's talking points without question started asking uncomfortable things. Why had Blake suddenly received a producer credit after the so-called safety letter? Why was Ryan allegedly rewriting scenes of a greenlit script during a strike? Why did every major leak seem to come at moments most convenient for Blake's rise and Justin's fall? And once those questions landed, even allies began to step back. The filings include notes that insiders described as whispers in Hollywood parties, people saying the couple had gone too far, that the smear campaign felt calculated, that using harassment claims as cover for a power grab crossed an unspoken line. And while none of this erased Justin's pain or the $9 million he had already spent defending his reputation, it created something new, a shift in balance, a sense that perhaps he wasn't the villain he'd been painted as, but a man fighting to keep his career alive against a juggernaut of spin and money and power. And you could see this shift in real time, not just in TikTok critiques or angry threads, but in how coverage began to evolve. Major outlets, once comfortable pushing the Blake and Ryan savior narrative, began hedging, adding context, hinting at controversy. And inside Justin's camp, there was relief. For the first time, they weren't just playing defense, they were watching the other side stumble, because perception is a fragile currency in Hollywood. And once the public starts to smell blood, the entire machine that seemed invincible can collapse faster than anyone expects. And collapse it did, in small waves at first, then in a tidal surge that no PR consultant could redirect, because the filings show how rattled Blake's team became as the marketing backlash collided with the unsealed court documents that revealed in black and white the very strategy they had hoped to keep hidden. Timed leaks, HR complaints that looked suspiciously orchestrated, Ryan's alleged script rewrites that may have violated union rules. Emails showing Justin warning friends months earlier that Blake was twisting the safety letter into unchecked power. These weren't rumors. These were receipts, and the juxtaposition was damning. On one side, a couple selling themselves as the victims; on the other side, evidence showing how they had weaponized that narrative for control, money, and clout. And the more people saw the receipts, the less the original spin held water. Suddenly, Blake wasn't the brave starlet fighting for safety. She was the actress accused of creating chaos by design. Ryan wasn't the witty husband saving the movie. He was the arrogant star accused of undermining a female writer during a strike, and Justin wasn't the villain anymore. He was the man trapped in a system forced to promote marketing he didn't believe in, forced to smile for cameras beside the very people orchestrating his destruction. The filings even capture emails where his PR team admitted, "This is madness. We are promoting material that hurts him, but we can't refuse without breaking contract." And when those lines went public, the sympathy began to swing. And here's the irony. Blake and Ryan's empire was built on controlling perception. But once, that perception slipped from their hands. Nothing could stop the fall because the backlash wasn't just anger about bad marketing. It was anger about being lied to. Manipulated sold a story that didn't match reality. And once the public feels, manipulated trust evaporates. And trust is the one currency more valuable than money in Hollywood. So by late 2024, the very machine that had elevated Blake and Ryan into untouchable icons was backfiring. Fans once fiercely protective began calling. Blake manipulative journalists openly questioned Ryan's arrogance industry. Whispers hinted at blacklists not official, but quiet, subtle. The kind where doors stop opening, scripts stop arriving, offers quietly disappear, and through it all, Justin, though far from vindicated, finally saw daylight for the first time in nearly a year, because the question was no longer, is he the problem, but how deep did Blake and Ryan's campaign go? And what did it cost Hollywood to let it happen? And those questions were about to get answers, because when the court finally unsealed hundreds of pages of emails, texts, and testimony, the story that emerged didn't just crack Blake and Ryan's carefully constructed facade, it demolished it. Here it is. The storm had been brewing for months, but part 4 is where it all came crashing down. And what had started as carefully crafted maneuvers by Blake Lively and Ryan Reynolds suddenly looked like the unraveling of an empire, because once those court documents were unsealed, it was no longer whispers in back hallways. It was no longer redacted statements floating around online. It was there in black and white, unfiltered and undeniable. The texts, the emails, the safety complaint, the fire records, and the legal filings all lined up into one unbroken timeline of manipulation, cover-ups, and fear. And the narrative they had fought so hard to control collapsed overnight. Hollywood had always been a place where power couples could project an image of perfection long enough to make people believe it. But here the projection cracked wide open. The legal filings showed a pattern, not just one angry email or a single miscommunication, but sustained actions over weeks and months, a paper trail so long and detailed that no spin could wash it away. Justin Baldoni, who had been painted as the aggressor, suddenly looked more like a man boxed into a corner by forces much larger than him, and the internet did not miss a beat. Fans and critics alike tore through the documents, screenshotting, highlighting connecting dots. The so-called conspiracy theories suddenly didn't look like conspiracies at all. They looked like the truth that had been hiding in plain sight: Ryan's interference. With the screenplay, which once seemed like just creative tinkering, now came across as deliberate sabotage. Blake's unfiltered text about blocking press calls no longer looked like a protective instinct, but like calculated censorship, and the HR complaint, once downplayed as routine, suddenly took on the weight of evidence that the set itself had become hostile. Not because of one person, but because of pressure from the very top. The marketing strategy, which had leaned so heavily on curated leaks and sympathetic press coverage, fell apart overnight, because you cannot sell romance when the documents show harassment. You cannot push empowerment hashtags when survivors online are saying they felt silenced and erased. You cannot run to glossy magazines when the raw filings are circulating on Reddit, Discord, and Twitter in real time. And here's the kicker. Every attempt to clean up the mess only made it worse. Ryan tried to shift blame onto studio lawyers, but insiders leaked that he had been warned months earlier. Blake's team tried to spin the HR complaint as exaggeration, but a second employee quietly confirmed their own experience in DMs that went viral overnight. The $9 million legal wall they had built to defend themselves looked less like strength and more like panic and desperation. And Hollywood studios noticed executives who once answered their calls immediately started keeping their distance. The couple who once held the keys to red carpet dominance found themselves ghosted by the very system they thought they had mastered. Producers whispered about pulling projects. Publicists warned clients to steer clear. Journalists who had once accepted their exclusives now treated them as case. studies in media manipulation, and the fallout was not just reputational, it was personal too. Because trust in their marriage had been one of their strongest shields. They had weaponized the image of the perfect couple for years. But suddenly that image turned against them. Every old interview, every quote about honesty and loyalty was replayed not as aspirational sound bites, but as ironic clips spliced into TikToks that went viral under captions like "Nothing ages worse than lies." The backlash was brutal, swift, and unforgiving. And yet through it all, Justin Baldoni stayed mostly silent. He didn't rush to claim victory. He didn't release a press tour to gloat. Instead, he quietly kept working on small projects aligned with his values, posting only sparse messages about empathy and healing. And in that silence, his credibility grew because where Blake and Ryan screamed louder and louder into a void, Justin's restraint looked like integrity, and audiences noticed the story flipped, not through flashy PR maneuvers, but through the natural gravity of truth pulling the entire scandal out into the open. And when the dust settled, it was clear nothing would ever go back to the way it was for years. Blake Lively and Ryan Reynolds had ruled the Hollywood relationship game. But in the end, it was not the tabloids or the bloggers or even their rivals that took them down. It was their own paper trail, their own fingerprints left behind in legal filings. They never thought would see the light of day, and the story of their downfall will now live in Hollywood history. Not as a glamorous romance, but as a cautionary tale of power, abused credibility, lost, and the dangerous illusion that no secret will ever be exposed until suddenly it is.
This video covers legal allegations in a news context. All claims are from official filings and no guilt is implied until proven in court, please. Keep all discussions respectful. Allegations are not facts until proven in court.